Welcome, everyone. I know folks are still joining, but I wanted to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to our Fall WAP Research Seminar Series. I am Anisha Asindi. I'm a research fellow at the Women in Public Policy program. WAP equips leaders and changemakers with rigorous evidence-based strategies to advance women and gender equity. And one of the ways we do that is through our weekly research seminar series. So really excited to have you all here with us today. Before we start, we wanted to offer a virtual land acknowledgement to honor local Indigenous communities on the land where Harvard University sits, which is the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary unceded homeland of the Massachusetts people, the surviving descendants of the first people of Massachusetts and of the Neponset Band of the Massachusetts. The WAP team have posted the link to our full land acknowledgement in the chat, and I encourage you all to explore the resources in addition to reading the statement. Our seminar this fall is exploring how gender researchers, policymakers, and practitioners can commit to strengthening the focus on intersectional research. We will explore how gender intersects with other social identities such as race, class, and national origin, disability, parental status, and sexual orientation. Our intersectional focus will not only address the unique experiences of people with these intersecting identities, but also engage with the systemic biases and oppressions which characterize these experiences. Many of the researchers we are featuring in our seminar series are also featured on our Gender Action Portal, and I encourage you all to explore GAP's intersectional work at gap.hks.harvard.edu. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Professor Aruna Ranganathan, presenting Work Family Programs and Non-Work Networks within Group Inequality, Network Activation, and Labor Market Attachment. Professor Ranganathan is Associate Professor of Management and Organizations at the Haas School of Business at UC Berkeley. She received her PhD from the Sloan School of Management at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and her research combines multiple methods to study how individuals identify with their work and make workplace decisions, and how organizations affect workplace and social inequality. Just want to go over some quick logistics before I turn it over to Professor Ranganathan. Our speaker will present for 45 minutes, and then we'll have 15 minutes for questions from our virtual audience. We ask that you hold your questions until the end of the talk, and those who have a question will have the opportunity to be unmuted to ask your question out loud. And we do ask that any audience questions be brief, on topic, and be posed in the form of a question and related to our presenters' research. My colleague, Katie Omberg, will be managing the Q&A portion of the seminar. And with that, I'm thrilled to turn it over to Professor Aruna Ranganathan. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Anisha, for that warm welcome. It's great to be here, and I'm very excited to have this opportunity to share some of my research with all of you. Most of my research thus far has focused on low-income occupations in India. And for the past couple of years, I've been focusing on studying a variety of challenges faced by women employed in garment factories in India. As Anisha mentioned, I often draw on a variety of different methods in my research, including interviews and participant observation, as well as field experiments and exploiting natural experiments when I can. So today I'll be presenting one of the papers coming out of this larger project. This paper is joint work with David Padula from the Sociology Department at Harvard. So the title of this paper is Work Family Programs and Non-Work Networks within Group Inequality, Network Activation, and Labor Market Attachment. It's a bit of a complicated title, but I hope to unpack that as I go forward. So over the past decades, many workplace organizations have implemented a wide range of work-family programs that are meant to help workers balance the competing demands of work and family life. So these include parental leave, having on-site access to childcare sponsored by an employer, or flexi time or control over one's work schedules. While well-intentioned, when scholars have studied the effects of these programs, they found mixed effects, where sometimes they find that these programs help workers, but other times they find that they don't. So for example, some studies suggest that work-family programs have a positive impact on workers by perhaps increasing their perceived schedule control or by reducing their perceived work-family conflict. But some other studies find null effects, suggesting that work-family programs might have no effect at all, or might even have negative career consequences for workers, where some work-family programs have been associated with weaker wage growth for women, and some programs have shown to have no effects on retaining women in the workplace. So there are two possible reasons for these inconsistent findings. The first is most of this research on studying the effectiveness of work-family programs thus far has been correlational in nature. So these studies could be subject to selection bias, where they just compare individuals who do and do not use employer-sponsored childcare, and this could threaten the validity of these studies. And a second possible reason is that often the programs being studied in this research focus on a highly heterogeneous group of workers. So often the programs are made available to both men and women, parents and non-parents, workers across functions, and this may obscure heterogeneity in who actually benefits from work-family programs. So in this paper, we first observe a highly homogeneous group of workers from within the same socio-demographic group, and we ask the question of whether work-family programs might have varied consequences even within this very homogeneous group of workers, and if so, why? We use a quasi-experimental research design to estimate the effects of one particular work-family program, hoping that this will offer higher internal validity than some of the prior studies in this area. So just to give you some sense of the context, we study low-wage women workers at a garment factory in India. So our population being studied, they're all women, they're all mothers, all Indian, all economically disadvantaged, all have limited education, and all work in the same factory and actually in the same role as a frontline assembly line worker. We focus on one important work-family program, employer-sponsored childcare, through an on-site childcare facility in this context. And we investigate the effect of this program on women's daily attendance at work, where we believe that daily attendance is an important indicator of women's labor market attachment. So just to be clear, our research question in this project is how does access to a work-family program affect the labor market attachment of a homogeneous group of disadvantaged workers? Is there variation in these effects among workers in this group? And if so, why? Now, we believe this is a really important research question because it moves the discussion from focusing on between group differences in the effectiveness of work-family programs to a focus on within group differences. And this is important because this could uncover new sources of inequality. It could shed light on particular subgroups of workers who might especially be in need of targeted workplace interventions, and can also shed light on new mechanisms driving the success of work-family programs. So before I go on, I want to quickly preview our results. So firstly, when we focus on this particular group of disadvantaged women workers in India, we find that access to employer-sponsored childcare really helps them. So we find that after women get access to employer-sponsored childcare, their attendance goes up by 5 percentage points. Now that's quite powerful in itself, but we additionally find variation in these effects. We find that the effect of childcare access varies by the gender of the working mother's child. In particular, we find that the attendance of women with daughters goes up by 7.5 percentage points in response to receiving access to this on-site childcare facility, whereas the attendance of women with sons only goes up by about 2.5 percentage points, a difference of 5 percentage points. So the positive effect of access to employer-sponsored childcare on workers' daily attendance here in our context is mostly driven by women with daughters. Now, this is a really important finding, but also quite puzzling. Why this difference in the effects by the gender of the child? So let me now present to you a quote by a working mother whom I interviewed, which kind of sums up the story that we propose in this paper. This working mother said, "For the girl child, the childcare center is more important. My parents are not taking care of my daughter. They are not even letting my daughter into their house. That's why I think my factory is the best place because they have a creche there to take care. That's why." And so what we argue in this paper is that even among a group of homogeneous workers from a similar socio-demographic background, there could be variation in the extent to which their non-work networks will activate support to provide childcare help. And we argue that this variation in the support offered by non-work or family social networks can drive within group differences in the effectiveness of work-family programs. In our particular context, we find that status characteristics of workers' dependence can shape the activation of family network support. So we focus in our paper on the gender of the child being an important status characteristic, driving whether or not a worker's extended family will offer childcare support. But in other contexts, this could be whether or not a child is gifted, whether they have behavioral or physical disabilities, or the race of the child. And we argued that these status characteristics could affect whether or not extended family offer childcare support, and thereby then go on to affect whether or not workplace programs are meaningful to workers. So more broadly, what we argue is that there's an important interplay between organizational and non-organizational sources of support for managing the demands of work and family life. And we hope that both practitioners and scholars of work will consider this important interplay going forward. So for the rest of this talk, I'll first discuss our theory and hypotheses. I'll then present some description of our setting, research design, and data. I'll then showcase our results and then end with some conclusions. So broadly, we situate this work in the sociological literature on gender, work, and family. This literature has long highlighted that women shoulder disproportionate family responsibilities with respect to caring for children, as well as managing a household, and that this can often limit women's employment opportunities with respect to their participation in the labor force, as well as the ability to maintain and advance a career. So in an attempt to address these challenges, a significant body of research has emerged to understand the sets of work-family programs and policies that may be able to mitigate these difficulties and help women balance their work and family life. So these programs include reduced hours programs, the ability to work from home, having a results-only work environment, as well as programs that train supervisors to be considerate of employees' personal needs. And while the overall effectiveness of these programs has been shown to be mixed, when it comes to disadvantaged workers in particular, there are reasons to believe that there will be a positive relationship between access to work-family programs and women's labor market attachment, for three particular reasons. The first being that disadvantaged women more often experience employment interruptions due to a lack of reliable childcare or issues with their informal care networks. So childcare is often a bigger problem for this group of workers. Second, childcare expenses themselves represent a higher proportion of income for disadvantaged workers as compared to higher wage professional women. And finally, among a group of disadvantaged workers, there's often less pressure to live up to an ideal worker norm of complete commitment to work. And so access to work-family programs might not suffer from as much, or signing up for a work-family program, women might not suffer from as much backlash for utilizing a program as they might in a different context. So for these three reasons, we first hypothesized that among disadvantaged workers, organizational work-family programs will have a positive effect on labor market attachment. We then move on to thinking about the heterogeneous effects of work-family programs. So here, as I mentioned earlier, prior research has focused on between group differences, showing, for example, that men and women often have very different experiences with work-family programs. For example, the Noonan et al. Study shows that the use of scheduled flexibility policies is associated with fewer weekly hours of housework for mothers, but fathers' uses of such programs have no association with their weekly hours of housework. And so while existing research like this has focused on important variation in the effectiveness of work-family programs among different demographic groups, in this paper, we draw attention to within-group differences in the effectiveness of work-family programs, a topic that has received less attention. So what we propose is that even within a given social demographic group, there's likely to be variation in how effective work-family programs are at promoting opportunity. In particular, the argument that we put forth is that even within a group of homogeneous women from within a particular social demographic group, there might be variation in their non-work network support that they receive for childcare and to help manage the competing demands of work and family life. So when I say non-work networks, what I mean is neighbors and grandparents, for example, or friends who often help workers navigate work and family domains. And what we argue is that these non-work networks might differentially offer support to some women and not others. And in particular, that the status characteristics of a working mother's dependents, such as whether their dependents have physical disabilities or behavioral disorders, or the demographic characteristics of their dependents, such as their gender and race, might elicit differential support from workers' non-work networks. So here we make the point that having access to network alters does not necessarily result in activation of network support. And so based on this, what we suggest is that if there is indeed variation in non-work network alters ability and willingness to offer childcare support, organizational work-family programs might be especially important to those who do not receive non-work network support. So this leads to our second hypothesis that among disadvantaged workers, organizational work-family programs will be more effective in promoting labor market attachment among workers whose non-work network alters are less likely to activate resources on their behalf. So to test these hypotheses, we draw on unique data. And so let me move on to describing our setting, research design, and data for this project. So we study a large garment factory in southern India. This factory was established in 2001. The factory has about 2,000 female workers, and it specializes in producing menswear, so trousers and jackets. In particular, this factory provides employer-sponsored childcare to some employees through an on-site childcare facility. This is a free resource, so once a woman receives access to this benefit, it's free of cost to her. However, there are limited spots in this childcare center, a feature that we use to exploit, a feature that we exploit to identify and estimate the results, the effectiveness of this work-family program. So in particular, we cite the effects of employer-sponsored childcare on women's daily attendance in this context. We focus on women's daily attendance because we believe that this is a key indicator of labor market attachment. And in this context, both a working mother's wages and her career advancement is closely tied to attendance. So if we wanted to estimate the effects of receiving access to this employer-sponsored childcare, what one would do in an ideal context is get a group of women, randomly assign some of them to a treatment group where they receive access to childcare, and assign others to a control group where they don't receive access to childcare. While we were not able to do this, we instead exploit a natural experiment that comes pretty close to this. So we identify a group of women, all of whom received access to this employer-sponsored childcare at some point, but some of these women randomly received access earlier, and some other women randomly received access later. And the timing of receiving access was quasi-exogenous in this setting. And so that's what we exploit to estimate the effects of employer-sponsored childcare in this setting. So in particular, we employ a within-person analytical approach where we compare women's daily attendance both before and after they receive access to the childcare center. Here, as I mentioned, the timing at which a woman receives access is varied and essentially random because a spot in the childcare center has to open up. And because this is a very valued resource in this setting, there's a long wait list and people don't really know when a particular spot is going to open up. So our identification strategy is to include worker-specific fixed effects, as well as fixed effects for the time period. So in order to test our theory around the role of non-work networks and the activation of this network support, in this setting, we exploit the fact that family-based networks are very important for childcare in India, especially with multi-generational households and extended family often living with parents and grandchildren. We also exploit the fact that there's a well-documented strong son preference in India. And so prior research has shown that the hope for a male heir often determines Indian parents' fertility decisions, as well as their allocation of resources among their children. So what we propose based on this is that non-work network alters might activate resources to offer childcare support for boys, but not for girls in this setting. So to be clear, we have 3 empirical predictions. The first is that there will be a positive relationship between access to childcare and women's daily attendance for the group of disadvantaged workers that we're observing in this garment factory in India. The second empirical prediction is that women with daughters will benefit more from access to childcare than women with sons. And finally, that this child gender effect, so this differential benefit for women with daughters as compared to women with sons, will be especially pronounced in households with non-work networks present. And particularly with non-work networks, we're able to measure whether a spouse is there in the household and whether the child's grandparents or whether the mother's parents or her parents-in-law are present in the household. And so with this, we hope to offer some support for the mechanism that the lack of activation of non-work network support is an important reason why women with daughters might benefit more from access to childcare. So we assemble a unique data set to test this. First, we obtained access to childcare records from this setting. These records were maintained manually in registers that we were able to digitize. We then matched this childcare record data to daily attendance data that we received from the factory. And we supplemented this data with survey data on employee characteristics, including data on their family structure and who all live in their household. And this survey was conducted by the factory, typically when a woman was joining that organization. So combining all these data sets, we create a worker date level data set tracking 160 low-wage workers between April 2012 and January 2016. Our key dependent variable is daily attendance, which is a 0-1 variable indicating whether a particular worker was present or absent on a given date. And our key independent variable is post childcare, which takes the value of 1 if a particular woman had received access to childcare on a particular date in the data set. So given that our dependent variable is a dichotomous variable, we use logistic regression models, but all our results are also robust to using OLS models instead. Now we supplement this quantitative data with qualitative data. This came from 22 semi-structured interviews that focused on family relationships and childcare arrangements. So 11 of these interviews were conducted with working mothers employed at the factory who used on-site childcare at this factory. And the remaining were conducted with their non-work networks, so their spouses or other extended family who help out with childcare. The average length of the interviews was 46 minutes. The interviews were conducted in Kannada at the interviewees' homes in private, so that the conversations were not subject to, not threatened by other family members being around. And they were typically conducted after hours in the evenings or on weekends. All these interviews were recorded, translated, and then transcribed in English, and then coded and analyzed using Atlas TI. So with that, let me move on to discussing our results. Let me start out by summarizing who the workers are in our data set. So just to remind you, all the workers in our data set are women. And important source of variation that we exploit in this setting is that about 10% of the workers in this setting are single, so their spouses aren't living with them in the household. And about 30% of the women live in multi-generational households with access to grandparents within the same household. And so this could either be the working mother's parents or her in-laws. With respect to the children at the childcare center, 48% of them were female children. And so seeing this number gave us some confidence that this is not a setting where we need to be worried about sex-selective abortion. So now, having assembled this data, our first question is, what is the effect of receiving access to childcare on working mothers' daily attendance? So here we use our worker date level data set and run logit models. Standard errors are clustered at the worker level. We'll focus on model 4 in this table, which is our most stringent model that includes month-year fixed effects as well as worker fixed effects. And what we see is that getting access to childcare has a positive and significant effect on a woman's daily attendance. And the result is quite sizable. So after receiving access to childcare, the odds of being present at work were about 1.7 times higher than when she did not have access to childcare. Now, this is also supported by our qualitative evidence. So one working mother said, compared to before, I take less leave after I received access to childcare because I have childcare next to my working place. Another working mother similarly said, if the factory did not have such childcare facilities, I might not go to work when my child needs me. So this gives us some confidence to support our first empirical prediction that among disadvantaged workers, there will be a positive relationship between getting access to childcare and women's daily attendance. We then move on to exploring variation by the gender of the child. So we decompose the main positive effect of receiving access to childcare and women's daily attendance for women with sons as compared to women with daughters. So the estimates again are from a logistic regression, including the variables post-childcare, daughter, and the interaction term post-childcare times daughter, where the categorical variable daughter takes a value of 1 when the child in the childcare center is a girl and 0 when the child is a boy. Again, here the standard errors are clustered by workers in all models. The first interesting thing to note is that in models 1 and 2, the coefficient for daughter is large, negative, and statistically significant, suggesting that women with daughters have lower odds of being present at work than women with sons, even before gaining access to the childcare center. Now then, across the models, we see the coefficient for post-childcare times daughter is large, positive, and statistically significant, suggesting that working mothers with daughters really benefited from having access to childcare. Moreover, the coefficient for post-childcare is not statistically significant, which suggests that receiving access to childcare was not really statistically meaningful for working mothers with sons. So this supports our second empirical prediction that there are important differences in who benefits from receiving access to childcare, even within this homogeneous group of working mothers in this garment factory in India, where women with daughters benefit a lot more than women with sons. So we then, ask the question of why this difference between women with daughters as compared to women with sons. And here we first uncovered the role of non-work networks in our interview. So let me present some qualitative data that shed some insight into the story we propose. The first thing we saw from the interviews we conducted is that interviewees suggested that non-work or family network alters seem to have a preference for caring for the boy child. So one working mother said, we had planned only for 2 kids, but since we didn't have a boy, my mother-in-law forced us to have 1 more kid, and then my son was born. And for this 3rd child, she's always there to take care. So more broadly, what we heard in the interviews repeatedly, both from the working mothers as well as from their extended family, is that family networks were more willing to offer childcare support to take care of sons rather than daughters. So another working mother said, one of my uncles lives near my parents and he helps to take care of my son after the school hours and getting him ready and other stuff. He doesn't really help my daughter. And so what this data led us to understand and uncover in this setting is that for these reasons, on-site childcare provided by an employer is likely to matter more for women with daughters because this employer-sponsored resource doesn't have biases and is more than happy to provide childcare for both girls and boys. And this came up in the interviews as well. So one working mother's mother-in-law said, the childcare center is more important for the girl children. In the home, there would be one or other family members who prefer to take care of boy children rather than girl children. So having uncovered this explanation, we sought to provide some quantitative support for this explanation as well. So what we did is we next split our overall sample by whether the worker's spouse or parents were present in the household, and then we reran our child gender analyses. So the idea here is that if our proposed mechanism is at play, the child gender effect should be especially pronounced in households with spouses or parents present. So for ease of interpretation, we visually depict our key regression coefficients. So this first bar here represents the overall estimated effect of childcare access on the log odds of being present at work for working mothers with daughters as compared to sons using the full sample. So this is the same post-childcare time daughter coefficient from the table that I showed you earlier. So the next 2 bars now represent the estimated child gender effect. First for when the woman's spouse is present, and then for when the woman's spouse is absent. And so what these bar charts indicate is that the additional benefits of access to childcare for working mothers with daughters are concentrated among the group of working mothers whose spouses are present, and that these differential benefits by child gender are indistinguishable from zero when the spouse is absent. And then we see a very similar, in fact, even stronger pattern for the presence of the working mother's parents or her in-laws. So in other words, what this shows is that when network alters are present, access to childcare is particularly beneficial for women with daughters. So this provides some direct evidence for our proposed mechanism of family-based network activation by highlighting that for those women with access to family-based networks at home, it's especially for this group of women that the women with daughters might especially benefit from access to employer-sponsored childcare. So what this more broadly shows is that non-work network activation is necessary to understand variation in the consequences of organizational work-family programs. So let me offer some concluding thoughts, and then I'm happy to open it up for a discussion and questions. So what we find in this study is first that employer-sponsored childcare has a strong positive impact on working mothers' daily attendance in India. We find that the positive effects of employer-sponsored childcare are concentrated among working mothers with daughters, and that the employer-sponsored childcare matters more for working mothers with daughters because family-based networks are less likely to provide informal childcare support for this group of workers. We believe that this study offers some important contributions. First, it highlights how the effectiveness of organizational programs might depend on how they intersect with workers' non-work social networks. Here we make this important point that just having availability or access to non-work networks does not necessarily translate into willingness to activate network support to take care of children. And what this highlights more broadly is that it's important for organizations to understand the domestic sphere of workers' lives and to be cognizant of cultural norms that might influence which workers might be particularly disadvantaged in a given context with respect to social network activation. Perhaps most importantly, what this suggests is that organizational work-family programs, such as the ones I started this talk with, so parental leave, access to on-site childcare, flexible time, do have the possibility to really improve employment outcomes for disadvantaged workers in the global South. And so organizations should continue to implement these programs just with a more nuanced perspective of how they intersect with non-work lives and non-work social networks among their workers. With that, I'll stop and I'm happy to take any questions. Maybe I'll stop sharing my slides so we can, so I can see everyone.
Awesome. Thank you so much for this. This was an awesome talk. If anyone has any questions, I invite you to go down to the reactions or the participants tab. It depends on how recently you updated your Zoom, and click the raise hand button. And that way we can get you in the queue. Awesome. So I see the Q&A is popping off. Laura, I will ask you to unmute now.
Hi, thank you so much. Thanks for sharing this fascinating work. It's really, really exciting to see it. So I had two questions, the first being a clarification question, and the second a question about theoretical implications. So as a clarification question, I was wondering if you found that there was a preference for childcare provided by family as opposed to provided at work. Is childcare at work always the backup option, or are there some reasons why mothers might prefer it? And second, more conceptually, I was wondering if you thought about implications for the literature on social network activation. So Sandra Smith and others have found really interesting variation in network activation according to characteristics of the person who's looking for help, but you're bringing in this new factor, which is characteristics of the third party about whom help is sought. So I wonder if you have thought about other cases where that might be relevant.
Thanks, Laura. Great to see you here. And thanks for these questions. So interestingly, in this context, the organizational childcare resource was very valued, and actually was not seen as a backup option by these workers, precisely because it is more reliable. Family sometimes they have to travel, they get sick, whereas the organizational resource is always there. It also means that during a woman's lunch break or her tea and coffee breaks, she could go and see her children if she wanted. And there was an educational component to this, to the childcare being offered here, whereas often the childcare at home was more caregiving without necessarily an educational component. So this was not seen as a backup resource and was actually valued by all the working mothers. In terms of the contributions to the social networks literature, absolutely, that was not something I got into in the presentation. But one of the things that David and I find really interesting and important about this work is that the social network literature has long distinguished between access to networks and mobilization or activation of those network resources. But typically in the context of job search, that's where they're focused most of their research on. And they've shown how some people might have access to resources, but unless those networks are going to activate support, specific individuals might not benefit from those networks. And so what we see as our contribution, so we do try to engage with that literature in our work, and what we see as our contribution is bringing that research to the study of work-family policies and gender inequality in the work-family domain, by showing that a similar phenomenon might be at play here, where we need to distinguish between non-work network support that women might have access to versus activation of those resources, because that is what truly determines whether organizational programs will be effective or not. And so while this is a tricky finding because it's hard to know sort of from a practitioner standpoint what an organization should do, it suggests that just an organization just knowing that a particular woman is has access to her parents or in-laws or friends or family or neighbors to offer childcare support is insufficient for them to believe that that woman is receiving help with childcare. They really need to know sort of the dynamics between the woman and her networks to know whether those network alters are activating support and offering help. So we do think this is an exciting direction for social network scholars to pay attention to, because it suggests that just beyond the job search context, that this difference between network support, having access to it, and mobilization of that support is really important.
Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. And then I see Anne has a question, and I'll ask to unmute you now.
Thank you very much, and thanks for your presentation. I had a question that's a bit theoretical as well, that's related to what do we consider to be the right group level, or how do you identify a group? Because so you motivated your paper by saying, do you have the contribution of even within group there are differences, but you could also very well argue that the group of women for whom you see this effect is itself a specific group. So what's really within group or between groups is yeah, I thought that your presentation got me thinking about that, and also related to like identity questions. So I don't know if this is something you've thought about more.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It's definitely something that we've thought about, and David and I have had discussions about this. And so I think the reason why we were trying to make that pivot is the bulk of the sociological literature on gender, work, and family that we came across had focused on how work-family programs might have differential effects for what we thought were very different groups, so men and women, parents, non-parents. And so it seemed that underlying this discussion was a point that if you look within a group, the results are going to be homogeneous. It's just that most of the variation is coming from these between group differences. And so we found that to be an assumption that we wanted to challenge, because when we look even within a group of women, economically disadvantaged, all doing the same kind of work, there are still important differences because their non-work lives might look very different. And so I think your point is absolutely well taken, that what the group is, I think, is like a moving target. But the main reason we highlight that in this project is we want scholars to move beyond just looking at sort of gross demographic differences among groups and how work-family programs that vary in their effectiveness for these groups, but also focus on groups of workers who seem similar on paper based on demographic characteristics, because they too might present with different responses to work-family programs, and we need to pay attention to these differences in order to identify subsets of workers who are especially in need of work-family programs.
Yeah. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Anne. All right. Great. Varia, I see your hand is raised. I'll ask you to unmute now.
Great, thanks so much. Very fascinating results. One thing I was thinking about is it looks like you have several of the mothers might have multiple children. I think the average was 2 kids. So I'm wondering if you could explore whether it's the gender of the child, where you kind of framed it as the status of the dependent, and you can maybe explore whether it's the status of the mother as a result of having at least one son. So I'm thinking about, if a grandparent is willing to take care of the son, or they're agreeing to accommodate the mother who has given them the male offspring they want, then are they still going to turn around and say, no, I'm not going to watch your daughter at the same time? So that'd be interesting to see.
That's a really interesting point. And it's something that I really hope that future research will look into. We just did not have enough power to be able to detect those differences. Related to what you just said, I think order of the children, like gender ordering of children could also matter. I mean, one thing I wonder is, building on what you just said, if the first child was a boy, does it then mean that the grandparents will offer childcare support for all the children, right? And so I think there are important next steps that I hope scholars will focus on with respect to if there's at least one male child, does that result in differential activation of network support? How the gender ordering of the children could also affect activation of network support. I hope that this study is just the first step in exploring how the children, their status characteristics, and more features will lead to differential activation of network support, and how that might then intersect with effectiveness of work-family programs. Thanks for that point.
Great, thank you so much. And I saw that there was 2 questions that came through in the chat, so I just want to make sure to tag up with those. Rachel asked a question about controlling for parents who leave children unattended at the home while they're at work. And Saika asked a question about the number of children, especially in the case of mothers with daughters having more children to try to get to having a son, and how that might impact the effectiveness of childcare for these mothers.
Great. So the first question, I'm wondering if you control for parents who leave children at home unattended. Is Rachel around? I wonder whether I could clarify. So, and because none of the women in this context leave children at home unattended. Like if there was no childcare arrangement, that's when they would actually not go in and instead stay home to take care of the child. So if Rachel's around, I'd love more clarification on that question.
It looks like we lost her, so unfortunately can't get more clarification.
Okay, no worries. But yeah, it's hard to know exactly what she meant with that question. So let me move on to Saika's question then. I may have missed this. Do these findings control for a number of children? I'm wondering in case mothers with daughters also tend to have more children, as suggested in the qualitative interviews, which could also impact the effectiveness of childcare for mothers. I don't think I presented these findings, but we do, in some robustness checks, control for a number of children, and our results are robust to that. So yeah, that's the answer to this. We also focused in this context among our 160 women. Most of them had only one child in the childcare center. There were only 3 instances of them having 2 children in the childcare center, in which case we focused on the first child. That's something else that is in the paper that I didn't mention during the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I think Anisha has a question.
Yeah, thank you so much for this amazing talk. So I know you talked about, I have more of maybe like a public policy question, but I know you talked about non-work support networks, usually in families, but are there any support systems within the organization across workers? So specifically not organizational support, but worker-led organizing that might help with childcare? Because I know in India and across the world, government workers especially organize in trade unions and have been very active in labor organizing. So, and especially as a support network within organizations. So I'm wondering if that came up at all in your qualitative interviews in terms of accessing the childcare options that exist or finding childcare support outside work.
So there was sort of women networks, women-led networks, and when it came to other issues in our context, but when it came to childcare, at least in the factory that we studied, the women relied either on family non-work network support or the organizational resource. So in the Indian context, this is mandated by law that factories of a certain size or larger need to have an on-site childcare. So this is a resource that actually women in garment factories in India often come to rely upon. And so this has quite broad implications in the Indian context. That being said, there was mobilization of women when it came to other things, especially bringing women into the workforce. So in a different project, different paper from focusing on the same study, focusing on the same setting, I find that women often had networks where they helped socialize newcomers into the setting, into sort of the norms of working to help them adjust to working life. And so the women, I think, were mobilized and they did organize and they did have strong peer-to-peer networks and connections, but not so much with respect to childcare.
Great, thank you so much.
Great, so I'm not seeing any other questions come up. If anyone else has anything, oh, great, Laura. Oh, you beat me right to it. All right, let's get you unmuted here.
Oh, I have another question. So it's about thinking about the implications of these findings for a context where you implied at the beginning of the talk that women who are maybe in higher level jobs might experience more of a flexibility stigma, right? There might be more stigma attached to actually activating these kinds of resources from the employer. So I was wondering just how you think about the implications of this study for that group of higher status employees. Are those women likely to be more dependent on outside resources? Would you expect to see a bigger effect of male versus female child because they would prefer to keep the child at home? They don't want to be taking advantage of this resource. I just wonder if you've thought about implications in that direction.
That's a really interesting question. And obviously we don't have data to directly speak to this. And so I think what the research mostly shows is that among professional higher paid among higher paid women in professional contexts, there might even be challenges to just using an employer work family program, right? And so that's something that we didn't observe in our context, where this was a value resource, and there's a long wait list, and a lot of women wanted to use this resource, which we think is a nice aspect of our setting. But to your point, so if we had to speculate the implications of this research in a more professional, high-paying context, perhaps the results would be even stronger, because I would imagine if working mothers are worried even about using an employer-sponsored work family program, then they're even more likely to rely on their non-work networks for childcare support. And if indeed these non-work networks are biased and they come with these preferences that vary based on the status characteristics of the children, then we would expect that these differences matter even more, and could especially hamper professional women who have dependents with undesirable status characteristics. So I think that would be a really fascinating issue to explore and study carefully in a more professionalized work context.
Thank you.
Awesome, thanks so much. And Pamela, I see you have your hand raised. if you feel comfortable turning on your camera, that would be awesome, but no worries. If not, I'll ask you to unmute.
Oh yeah, sorry about that. I'm in commute, so I can't turn on my camera, but thank you so much for such a great presentation. I really, really enjoyed it. I had a clarification question regarding methodology. I think in one of your slides, under the table, it said like number of observations was about like, I think I read like 5,000 or 58,000 or something like that. And I was wondering what that was referring to. Is it like number of people across like different like workspaces, or is it like the same people but over a course number of days, that kind of thing? Because I remember you mentioning 160 people at some point, so I was just a bit confused by that. But thank you so much.
Absolutely. And sorry if I glossed over that in the presentation. So the data set that we assembled is at the worker date level. So what this means is that we track 160 women across a 4-year period, so between 2012 and 2016. And so each observation in the data set is a specific worker on a specific date during that time period. And so that's why we get a much larger number of observations, closer to 50,000, because we're tracking a small group of women workers, but we're observing them on every single day over a long period of time.
Okay, got it, got it. Thank you so much.
Of course.
Awesome, thank you so much for that. Let's see, I see we have another question pop up in the chat. Did you explore reasons why family networks are not in favor of supporting with childcare for girls?
Yeah, so this is something that is prevalent in India, but surprisingly, the more I've presented this research, I'm realizing that a son preference is not just specific to India or South Asia, but we see evidence for our son preference more broadly, even among Asian immigrants here in the US. And so this son preference, I think, historically stems from the idea that a male heir will better take care of, will sort of carry the family line forward and will possibly also better take care of parents when they get old, because they will bring in, financial stability. So across cultures around the world, scholars have documented that there is often a strong son preference, and that's precisely what we see in this context, where family network alters will not provide support to take care of girls just because they prefer boys.
Awesome, thanks so much for that response. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'd love to just wrap up with one final question from me. Professor Ranganathan, is there anything that you didn't get to share with us today that you would like us to know?
That's a really interesting question. I don't think there's anything that I didn't share today that I would like you to know. I just hope that going forward, we see more and more research on work-family programs across the world. I feel like the bulk of the research that has been conducted on the effectiveness of work-family programs has focused on Western contexts. But this is an important resource, perhaps even more important, an even more important resource for workers, in the global South. And I just hope that there will be more attention to the effectiveness of work-family programs and under what conditions they work, they don't work, what makes them more successful in non-Western contexts going forward.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And I'll turn it over to Anisha.
Thank you so much, Professor Ranganathan, for joining us today and sharing your incredible research. And thank you to all of you for attending and joining our conversation today.